Alright you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is called Operation Bright Lights, Big City. Azusa 13, 813, also known as Barrio Azusa 13, is a multi-generational Sureño street gang based out of Azusa, California. The name of the gang denotes that the gang is from the city of Azusa, while the number 13 identifies its loyalty and allegiance as being under the umbrella of the Mexican Mafia's control. Located in the heart of the San Gabriel Valley, Azusa 13 pretty much dominates the city of Azusa and is believed to have originated in the 1960s. Like a lot of the other Sureño street gangs that occupy that part of eastern Los Angeles and the surrounding areas such as Baldwin Park, El Monte, West Covina, Montebello, and other counties in close proximity such as Riverside, Ontario, San Bernardino, Pomona, Azusa 13 is one of the more active gangs that has strong ties to the Mexican Mafia. The majority of Azusa gang members that get sent to prison and are exposed to MA politics end up aspiring to be camaradas and then ultimately imeros. This is because Azusa 13 is a gang that not only has resilient ties to the MA in prison, but it's a gang that also has resilient ties to the MA on the streets. Despite the gang evolving sometime around the 1960s and making national headlines in a number of different cases, this gang gained a lot of exposure and notoriety in 2011 after 51 members from Azusa 13 were indicted on federal racketeering charges such as drug trafficking, strong-arm robbery, and murder. However, the mainstream media has emphatically claimed that their most high-profile offenses are the hate crimes committed against African Americans who live in the city of Azusa. The media undoubtedly has ran extensive reports in the past indicative that Azusa 13, along with other gangs such as Barrio 155 Compton, Barrio 204 Torrance, and Barrio Hawaiian Gardens, have all acted under the Mexican Mafia's influence and direction to rid and cleanse their neighborhoods of all African Americans. Some of this might sound familiar to you guys, as I just covered some of this in the last profile I dropped on VHG, Barrio Hawaiian Gardens, and the killing of Los Angeles deputy Jerry Ortiz. Deputy Ortiz was ambushed and killed by VHG member Jose Sepi Orozco after Ortiz was called out to investigate the shooting of an African American middle-aged man the day before. Another VHG member that was sentenced to California's death row at around the same time was Joseph Mercado, who allegedly went on a shooting rampage, killing his ex-girlfriend Serena Terrin, her brother Alfred A.D. Terrin, and her father Alfredo Terrin. In 2012, Santiago Chico Rios, a highly influential member and leader of Azusa 13, pled guilty to conspiracy charges for violating the civil rights of African Americans and the Corruption Organization Act, RICO. Chico confirmed in court that members of the Azusa 13 gang tagged racial slurs on street signs, walls, and buildings to threaten and intimidate law-abiding citizens of the African Americans in Azusa. Due to the lack of other gangs that have evolved out of the regions of the San Gabriel Valley, they tend to feud with gangs outside the city of Azusa. For instance, they feud with gangs in West Covina such as West Covina 13, West Covina Mob, Bloods, and the West Covina Neighborhood Crips. They've also been known to feud with gangs in Baldwin Park, mainly the Northside Bowling Parque 13, and gangs in El Monte, which is home to El Monte 13. But Azusa 13's real problems began sometime on or around June 7, 2011, when federal authorities unveiled a 24-count federal indictment against 51 members and associates of the Azusa 13 street gang. Law enforcement opted to charge this case as a far-reaching superseding federal indictment for a multitude of different reasons. For one, some of the overt acts that are being charged in this indictment span back almost 18 years, and they involve a long-running plot to violate the civil rights of African Americans who live in the city of Azusa. Secondly, and just as important, the conspiracy to violate the civil rights of the African Americans who were targeted in different parts of Southern California are said to be connected and influenced by the Mexican Mafia prison gang. Anytime you have a criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia that plays some type of role in a criminal conspiracy, the feds are always quick to take jurisdiction and charge it as a RICO indictment. Prior to this case coming to fruition in 2011, the feds, along with a swath of other local law enforcement agencies, converged on another highly active Southern California street gang, the Avenues. Like the investigation involving the Hawaiian Gardens, over 1,100 law enforcement officers, along with over 300 federal agents, carried out a string of pre-dawn raids that was later dubbed Operation Bright Lights, Big City. The investigation specifically targeted what was described as a long-standing effort to terrorize the neighborhood it operates in by any and all means necessary. This included physical assaults, shootings, gangland-style murders, and the killings of yet another Los Angeles deputy, Abel Escalante. Authorities claim that the Avenue Street Gang was responsible for targeting this neighborhood for years, and that residents were terrified to say anything to police because they feared that they would be assaulted, beaten, or killed. The indictment read like a laundry list of gang crime: the murder of rivals, prolific drug dealing, weapons violations, and money laundering. I ran a profile on some of this and the extensive involvement the Aguirre brothers both asserted over this neighborhood, the Avenues. Prosecutors claimed that the Avenues gang preyed on community members, with two named members who were accused of attacking a resident in a parking lot, then shooting him to death when he tried to call for help. Another woman was pistol whipped, then shot at, but survived to identify an assailant by the fedora-wearing skull he had tattooed on his chest. Not to get off topic, but when I was just a young 11 or 12-year-old gang member, I remember one of my homeboys giving me one of my first tattoos. He took the pattern out of a Teen Angels magazine and tattooed it on my chest. Years later, I would be asked about this tattoo and what it represented, as it was actually the skeleton wearing the fedora that the Avenues used as the symbol to represent their neighborhood. I had no idea, and to me, it was just a pattern that looked cool. But later, I would find out that it meant something, and that it actually represented a Sureño gang. I'll try to find the picture and incorporate it in this profile so you guys can see it, but I eventually ended up getting it covered. So the indictment that targeted the Avenues also included acts of violence aimed specifically at the police. Two of these incidents culminated in two specific acts that ended up rocking law enforcement to the point of desperation and urgency. The first incident involved Avenues gang members opening fire with handguns and an AK-47 on Los Angeles police officers. In this same incident, police ended up returning fire, killing Daniel Clever Leon and injuring another gang member. This happened at the intersection of Drew Street and Astara Avenue in Glasso Park. I remember when this happened, as it was all over the local news. It originally started on February 21st, 2008, when Cypress Park gang member Marco Silas was shot and killed by members of the Avenues gang. Marco was walking with his 2-year-old son at the intersection of Drew and Astara Avenue in Glasso Park when he was struck by gunfire. Miraculously, his 2-year-old son wasn't hit. When police arrived on the scene, they were met with automatic gunfire by members of the Avenues gang. This is when police returned fire, killing Clever. Another incident involved a former leader of the Drew Street clique and Mexican mafia enforcer turned informant named Francisco Pancho Real. He was allegedly summoned to a park near his house on Drew Street by his MA contacts. After arriving at the park, he was given directives to whack a recently paroled fellow Avenues gang member named Frank Kiko Cordova. Pancho in turn then called another Avenues gang member named Carlos Ryder Renteria for the purpose of assisting with the hit. When these two caught up with Kiko later that day in a park, in broad daylight, Pancho pulled out a handgun and fired in the air to scare away other people who were in the area. When people dispersed and started running to get away from the shooting, Ryder walked up to Kiko and shot him to death. After the murder, Pancho went back to his house on Drew Street, changed his sweatshirt, met with his wife and daughter, and then went on about his day. Later, he would end up testifying about the details of this murder, and as a result, Ryder was convicted and given 15 years to life for the murder, on top of another 25 years to life for a firearm enhancement. In another preliminary hearing, he testified in against 3 other Drew Streeters charged in the shooting death of a member of a rival gang. He described that murder and how his real-life brother, Clever, was killed minutes later during the shootout with Los Angeles police gang detectives. The shootout took place on Drew Street after gang detectives claimed that Clever and another Drew Street gang member named Jose Angel Gomez fired at them with an AK-47 assault rifle first. Angel was also shot and survived, but Clever was hit multiple times and was pronounced dead on the scene. The Drew Street gang had what was considered to be a hardcore crew of riders who were known as the A-Team or the Killer Squad. They were used to go on missions against some of their rivals. A network of families related by birth and marriage cemented and solidified the gang. Pancho and Clever's mother was referred to as the Mother of the Avenues. Maria Chata Leon was an illegal immigrant from La Chapa. She gave birth to 14 children, including 10 sons by 4 different men. The house she owned on Drew Street was referred to as the Satellite House because of the massive satellite dish that was affixed to the top of the roof. It's a well-known fact that families in Mexico would sometimes affix huge satellite dishes or antennas to the roofs of their houses, as this was supposed to signify that you have money and live with some of the nicer luxuries in life. For years, she was the much feared head of a drug-dealing dynasty that her murderous gang-banging sons helped to create. Later, the city of Los Angeles symbolically destroyed the house with bulldozers as a way of representing that they had defeated the Drew Street clique and that they had destroyed a structure that stood for evil and lawlessness. The house that was once considered a fortress guarded by laser trip wires and dozens of video surveillance cameras has now been relegated to a vacant dirt lot with piles of garbage where the huge satellite dish was once erected. Ironically, Ryder, the Drew Street gang member that was convicted for shooting and killing fellow Drew Street gang member Kiko, had a brother named Jose Snapper Renteria who would end up getting convicted for his involvement in the killing and shooting of Los Angeles deputy Abel Escalante. Snapper wasn't the actual trigger man. Instead, he was accused of providing the weapon that was used to kill the deputy. Carlos Stoney Velasquez was the one accused of being the actual trigger man. On the day of the shooting, he jumped out of the car and jammed Deputy Escalante up outside his Cypress Park home as the deputy was getting ready to go to work at the Men's Central Jail in downtown Los Angeles. As the deputy was ruffling through his duffel bag that he had located in the trunk of his car, Stoney asked him where he was from. Sensing trouble, the deputy, who was not in uniform, said he wasn't a gang member and began to slowly step away from Stoney, who then just started shooting without provocation. I've said this before, but unfortunately, when a gang member jumps out and jams up someone who he assumes might be a rival gang member, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't matter what you say or how you respond to that question, because he's already made his mind up about what he's gonna do, and more often than not, he's out for blood. Not long after committing the murder, Stoney and the other defendants were implicated by Pancho from Drew Street. Stoney was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Guillermo Flea Hernandez, Armando Chivo Albaran, Arnaldo Pineda, and Roberto Salazar all pled out to voluntary manslaughter and received prison sentences ranging from 14 to 21 years. Snapper, who was also convicted of providing the murder weapon and conspiracy to commit murder, was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison. The case not only got messy when Pancho flipped and agreed to testify, but several recorded jail conversations hurt these guys when they were in custody as well. About a month before Deputy Escalante was even killed, they were investigating some of these guys and intercepted several incriminating conversations. For example, the 2 Renteria brothers, Ryder and Snapper, were recorded in a jail-recorded phone call talking about guns and some of the shootings. During that conversation, Snapper stated that he had a Mickey's and that it was a 40 ounce and that it was a G. This was easily deciphered by one of the gang experts that testified at the trial later. Guns are often referred to as Mickeys, and as the gang expert articulated, the real context of the conversation were references to a .40 caliber gun. Then Ryder later had another conversation with an individual by the name of Alex Gunner Valencia, where references were made about the killing of Deputy Escalante. As Ryder continued to bring up the deputy's killing, Gunner kept telling him to stop talking about it. But just the fact that he made references to it was damaging considering the totality of the whole conversation. One other killing of a Los Angeles police officer that was also committed by members of the Avenue Street gang involved the shooting and killing of Los Angeles police officer Juan Diaz. The officer was shot and killed as he sat with his girlfriend and her 2 brothers outside of a Lincoln Heights taco stand near Avenue 26 and Humboldt Street. The murder of Officer Diaz sent painful echoes and memories of the 2008 murder of well-liked Los Angeles deputy Abel Escalante, as both cases had a lot of similarities. Yet, still another groundbreaking criminal case that was one of the first to be brought by the Department of Justice also involved 4 Avenues 43 gang members. The prosecution described the defendants as being heavily influenced by the Mexican Mafia's racist anti-black campaign that called for the removal of all African Americans in their neighborhood. The 4 defendants, Alejandro Bird Martinez, Fernando Sneaky Cesares, Gilbert Lucky Saldana, and Porfirio Dreamer Avila, were all charged with violating federal hate crime laws and sentenced to life in federal prison. Fast forwarding back to the 2011 investigation involving Operation Bright Lights Big City and the allegations that Azusa 13 gang members were proactively pursuing ways to rid and cleanse its community of African Americans, this is a step-by-step synopsis of the indictment and how it progressed according to law enforcement. Azusa 13 was designated as an enterprise or a vehicle, so to speak, that carried out and conducted the racketeering and corrupt activities on behalf of the Mexican Mafia. The fundamental purpose of the Azusa 13 gang was to enrich its members and associates through the distribution and control of narcotics and monetary kickbacks, i.e., the collection of rent from other narcotics traffickers who were selling dope in their territory. In the eyes of law enforcement, when a gang such as Azusa 13 operates in a territory it claims as its own, its purpose for claiming this territory is not only to designate those grounds as its own, but its purpose is also to preserve and expand the power of Azusa 13 through the use of intimidation and violence. Acting under the cloak of the Mexican Mafia, the key holders, or those that exerted influence over the others in this indictment, were Santiago Chico Rios, George Danger Salazar, Antonio Flaco Moreno, Luis Luista Martinez, and Jose Negro Alfaro. As members of Azusa 13 who maintained a level of influence and control over the rest of the gang, these 5 also exerted control over the streets, their associates, and those that they were taxing. These were the ones who actually collected the taxes, enforced the M's edicts on the streets, and they were also the ones who were expected to maintain an open line of communication with their channels in prison. Similar to how we operated in NF regiments in Northern California, these guys pretty much distributed their narcotics, utilized their manpower, and taxed people the same way. They also used different methods to evade detection for the specific purpose of protecting their criminal enterprise. This means they basically used methods of covert communication whenever they could, knowing that law enforcement infiltration was always imminent. This included using what's been referred to as carnival talk, or using coded or guarded language to communicate, limiting the use of cell phones, and warning each other whenever they communicated about the possible presence of law enforcement. Did you guys know that this is actually part of the Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organization Act, RICO? If law enforcement has your phones tapped and they're monitoring your communications, they actually look for things such as if you're implementing different forms of covert communications to avoid law enforcement detection. By simply devising these safeguards and warning each other to be cautious about what is said, this falls within the RICO statute or the criteria they use. As these guys began to grow and they continued to establish their presence in Azusa 13, the act of procuring, brokering, and obtaining firearms to protect and preserve their territory is the next progression of their charged RICO activities. Other key players besides Chico, Danger, Negro, Luista, and Flaco that were instrumental in obtaining firearms for Azusa 13 were Little Bernie, Solo, Blue, Guerra, Rusher, Pelon, Casper, Little Bandit, Hefty, and Stalker. Most of the guns were obtained on the streets through some of the drug clientele who would bring the guns to the gang for the purpose of trading the guns for drugs. This was the way we used to accumulate guns, through some of the dope fiends who were just trying to get a little bit of dope for whatever they would bring. Aside from these guys, then we had other connections to people who used to traffic new guns at wholesale prices. This is where we would buy the bulk of our guns, through some of the contacts we had like this. The other good thing about this is that these guns were brand new. They didn't have no bodies on them, so we didn't have to worry about anything ever coming up if someone got caught with one. According to the indictment, Chico, Danger, Luista, Negro, Zombie, and Rusher acted as the enforcers, or the ones who used to impose intimidation or acts of violence on people that they were dealing with. When I functioned in the street regiments back in the early 90s, everything was compartmentalized. Everyone was assigned to a specific crew based on your qualifications or what you were good at. At that time, regiments weren't even called regiments, they were called colonias. We had a robbery crew, a wrecking crew, a crew who was tasked with taxing and extortion, a bank robbery crew, and a leadership body. It seemed like Azusa 13 had a similar structure by assigning different members to different crews. However, they seem to have had some members who were assigned to multiple crews and who performed a variety of different tasks. But keep in mind, there is a lot of differences between comparing a criminal organization like the NF and a structured street gang like Azusa 13. Despite the obvious parallels between the two, one still has the mentality of a street gang. For example, Azusa 13 had a crew that was designated to maintain control of its territory by tagging. They would tag their monikers, the gang symbols, and anything else representative of Azusa 13. Everyone knows that this is how gangs communicate. You can tell a lot about what's going on just by reading graffiti. Who's from what hood, who's beefing, who doesn't get along with who, and who are considered to be allies. Again, according to the indictment, Chico, Little Dreamer, Zombie, Rusher, Casper, Little Bandit, and Hefty were the ones who were responsible for tagging and striking up the gang's presence in their hood. Based on the indictment, aside from the issues involving the African Americans that they were proactively attempting to remove from the community of Azusa, they also had regular meetings and get-togethers to discuss other issues that they were having with some of their rivals, such as La Puente 13, Baldwin Park Northside, and the Do Rock Crip Gang. This is also when Azusa 13 began this campaign to start attacking African Americans in their neighborhood. These were some of the overt acts that they were charged with, and these excerpts were copied directly from the actual indictment itself. I understand that some of this information is inflammatory and that some of the verbiage is offensive, and for this reason I have censored some of the racial slurs. On May 7, 1992, Pelon, Stranger, and other members of the Azusa 13 gang attended a gang meeting at Pioneer Park in the city of Azusa, during which a participant at the meeting stated the words to the effect of, "Let's talk about ninjas." On May 7, 1992, an unidentified co-conspirator, member, or associate of the Azusa 13 gang informed other members of the gang that he had patrolled the alley by a residence where African Americans lived within the gang's territory. On May 15, 1992, unidentified co-conspirator members of the Azusa 13 gang tagged Get Out Ninjas, A13, and Azusa 13 on the garage doors of a residential complex in the city of Azusa in order to intimidate the African American residents who members of the Azusa 13 gang had discussed at the gang's May 7, 1992 meeting. On October 24, 1992, Solo and Pelon and other members of the Azusa 13 gang surrounded Leonard Lewis, an African American male who was in Azusa 13 gang territory, produced a knife, chanted "Stick 'em," and chased him. On October 24, 1992, Solo and Pelon and other members of the Azusa 13 gang surrounded the residence in which Leonard Lewis was hiding and shouted "Pinche Negra" and "Come out Ninja." On March 29, 1993, Pelon and other members of the Azusa 13 gang chased and hit Frank Arnold, DeAndre Carson, and Robert Luttrell, three African American males who were in Azusa 13 gang territory, while Pelon said, "We hate ninjas, F ninjas." On July 21st, 1994, during the attack on Rolando Gaines by Solo and other members of the Azusa 13 gang, an unidentified co-conspirator member of the Azusa 13 gang broke the window of Rolando Gaines' vehicle and stole Rolando Gaines' car stereo as Rolando Gaines hid in a nearby convenience store in order to avoid being further attacked by the gang. On January 24, 1997, Flacco wrote a business plan for the Azusa 13 gang in which, among other things, Flacco informed other members of the Azusa 13 gang that members reserved the exclusive rights to control the underground drug market in Azusa, and instructed Azusa 13 gang members to 1. Imagine the barrio as a company and imagine the homeboys as employees of this company. That the company provides security services, protection, and exclusive sale rights within the Azusa city limits. 2. Select a representative to speak to all individuals selling narcotics in the city of Azusa in order to explain those narcotics distributors that the Azusa 13 gang will offer and guarantee full protection that the gang members will collect from their customers that are refusing to pay, and that the Azusa 13 gang will harshly deal with anybody who is interfering with their business. 3. Warn all narcotics distributors in the gang's territory that anybody refusing to cooperate with the company policy will not be allowed to conduct business within Azusa city limits and will be subject to severe punishment. 4. Send its wrecking crew to steal non-compliant individuals, narcotics, money, and valuables, or to kidnap a family member of the narcotics distributor. And 5. Invest in company supplies and equipment and to maintain top-of-the-line artillery, AKs, SKSs, Tech 9s, Mini 14s, bulletproof vests, scanners, walkie-talkies, and binoculars. Flacco also reminded the Azusa 13 gang members who were part of the business plan that the gang's main objective is to monopolize the entire drug market in the city of Azusa, and further reminded the gang members to make contributions to members of the Mexican Mafia. On October 1st, 1998, Danger and other members of the Azusa 13 gang yelled, "Azusa 13 and F you ninjas. Get out of our neighborhood. Don't come back," at Keith Carter, Candy Tammons, and other African Americans who were in Azusa 13 gang territory. On October 20th, 1998, R. Garcia sent money collected by the Azusa 13 gang to Negro, who was in custody. On February 4th, 1999, Danger and other members of the Azusa 13 gang threatened and intimidated Joseph Smith and Jackie Mason, African Americans living within Azusa 13 gang territory, by yelling words to the effect of, "F you ninjas, F you ninja, biatch. I'm gonna get you effing ninja and kill you. I'm gonna shoot up your house, ninja," and Azusa 13 at Joseph Smith and Jackie Mason while they were outside Joseph Smith and Jackie Mason's house. On January 14, 2000, Casper and another member of the Azusa 13 gang hit Jacob Johnson on the back of the head. On March 21st, 2004, Little Chico, who was accompanied by other members of the Azusa 13 gang, confronted Damian Raymond, an African American male who was in Azusa 13 gang territory. And Little Chico said A13 and Little Chico, Damian Raymond, a ninja. On April 17, 2004, Smiley possessed a folding knife with Azusa 13 scratched onto the handle. On May 25, 2004, Little Bandit, who was in the company of two other members of the Azusa 13 gang, yelled "F you ninja" at David Brooks, an African American male who was in Azusa 13 gang territory, and stole David Brooks' cellular telephone. On May 25, 2004, Little Bandit, who was in the company of two other members of the Azusa 13 gang, brandished a firearm at David Brooks. On November 6, 2004, Little Chico and other members of the Azusa 13 gang tagged their gang monikers on a residential complex in the gang's territory and wrote the words Azusa 13 and F Ninjas on a wall in the laundry room of the complex. On May 7, 1992, Belon and other co-conspirator members of the Azusa 13 gang agreed to kill African Americans by invading the garage of the residence where the African Americans lived and shooting them. There were a lot of other overt acts and other documented occurrences in the indictment that are called objects of the conspiracy. However, there was too many to include all of them. I just documented some of them to demonstrate the progression of their objective and to exhibit how they seem to get more bolder and more aggressive with every ensuing act. Also, rather than to include my own narrative about these overt acts, I thought it was important to include the actual language that was contained in the indictment, so that you guys could grasp the full scope of it and exactly what they were alleging was being said. Again, racism and this type of hate is an ugly thing, but unfortunately, it's a real part of life that exists and people need to be aware of it. In the end, most of the defendants charged in Operation Bright Lights Big City were convicted and sentenced to prison. The same thing that happened with Operation Knockout and the indictments against the Hawaiian Gardens gang basically happened with Operation Bright Lights Big City. Not long after that, federal racketeering indictments against Sureño street gangs began pulling in hundreds of Sureño gang members off the streets and back into prison. Soon the war on blacks finally began to sputter to an end. By 2010, much of the classic gang violence that had plagued Southern California's working class neighborhoods was disappearing. Graffiti began to vanish. Parks once again became safe for children, and while gangs still persisted, they became more focused on economic crimes like drug dealing, credit card fraud, gun running, smash and grab jewelry robberies, and pimping. Not great by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly better than the race hate mayhem that had come before. And for law enforcement, they looked at this, however small it was, as a major accomplishment. These types of effectuations are what normally happens following a massive indictment, when a gang or a criminal organization loses a lot of its control. You see a huge de-escalation in activity before a change in power causes a vacuum effect. Because of the indictments, the streets are considered hot. So more often than not, gangs will temporarily resort to white-collar crimes and step away from the more serious organized crimes that got them caught up. You also see a domino effect that spills over to demographics, economical changes, changes in the housing market, and sometimes a much-needed reprieve in gang activity. Some of these changes gave many Latino neighborhoods a new lease on life. Property values began to soar, and residents could finally unlock the value in their homes that so many Southern Californians took for granted. In Los Angeles, homicides began a multi-year decline, something that you don't see too often. Something that's almost never seen. One other case, however, that also sent another Sureño gang member to death row for what was said to be a racially motivated killing involved a Sureño named William Willbone Satelli, who I actually know personally. I was with Willbone in the Adjustment Center at San Quentin back in the mid to late 90s. Willbone was definitely an up-and-coming Sureño on death row who exhibited a lot of influence. This was something I could just see from being there with him. Certain Sureños were embraced within the circle of leadership on death row, and he was one of them. What I mean is this: you had a lot of young Sureños who were getting convicted and sentenced to death row back in the 90s. Some of them would just be out there on the exercise yard interacting with the majority of other Sureños. And then you had those that would interact with the leadership, guys like Ronnie and Hector Ayala, or at that time, Alfredo Chato Sandoval. I used to see them out there, and Willbone was always part of that leadership circle. Aside from some of his own personal attributes of just being one of the bigger Sureños there, he also carried himself well, and I'm sure that this was a factor as well. Anyways, his case involved the killing of an African American couple named Edward Robinson and his girlfriend Renisha Fuller. They were shot and killed outside of Robinson's townhouse at 254th Street and Frampton Avenue in Harbor City. According to the police, Willbone had a co-defendant named Daniel Speedy Nunez, and they were both from West Side Wilmas. There was another individual who was supposedly with Willbone and Speedy the night of the murders. His name was Juan Caballero, and he was later identified as the driver of the getaway car that was used in the murders. After the murders were committed, they ended up meeting with another West Side Wilmas gang member named Joshua Contreras. One of the witnesses who testified in the case, Ernie Vasquez, stated that he heard Willbone tell Contreras that they had been out looking for ninjas that night. Immediately after this was said, Vasquez said he heard Speedy say, "And I think we hit one of them." This is an actual excerpt of the case. Willbone told Contreras he was driving right there in Harbor City and he saw a black guy or a black girl hugging or kissing or something, and he just shot them. Later that night around 3:40 a.m., Los Angeles police officers Adam Greenberg and Vin Nguyen were in a marked police cruiser when they saw a car later identified as a four-door Chrysler driving with its headlights off. The Chrysler pulled over to the curb. As the officers pulled in front of the Chrysler and activated their car's emergency lights, 3 occupants fled the Chrysler. Officer Greenberg identified Speedy as the person who had been driving and Willbone as the person who had been seated in the front passenger seat. The police pursued Willbone and arrested him. On the Chrysler's driver's seat was a white baseball cap with the word West on the front and the name Speedy on the back. Between the driver's and passenger seats was a large semi-automatic Norinco Mac 90, an AK-47 type assault rifle. The rifle was identified as the murder weapon through ballistics testing. A magazine attached to the weapon contained 26 live rounds of jacketed hollow point cartridges. The magazine was capable of carrying 30 rounds. Joshua Contreras, who had joined the West Side Wilmas gang shortly before the two murders, told police that both Wilbone and Speedy were riders, guys who killed their enemies, and that they had an AK-47 rifle that they called Monster. Contreras saw Wilbone put the AK-47 into the car that Speedy had shortly before Wilbone was arrested. Later on in the case, it talks about several incriminating conversations that took place in the Linwood County Jail. These are experts of those conversations. On December 3rd, 1998, several weeks after the two murders, Ernie Vasquez and Wilbone were in a cell in the Los Angeles County Jail. When Wilbone heard that Vasquez was from Harbor City, he asked Vasquez if he had heard about the killings there. When Vasquez said, "I think so, yes," or something to that nature, Wilbone said, "Well, we did that, or possibly I did that," adding, "I AK'd them," or "we AK'd them." Vasquez mentioned these statements to police officers on January 6, 1999, after his fingerprint had been found on the victim Fuller's car. At Vasquez's request, he was then transferred to the Linwood jail, which was closer to his home. On January 7, 1999, Speedy, who was a trustee at Linwood jail, approached Vasquez. Speedy asked if Vasquez was from Harbor City, and Vasquez said yes. Speedy said he had killed those ninjas in your neighborhood. Speedy mentioned that he had been driving down the street when one of the victims looked at him wrong, so Speedy turned back around and blasted them fools. On February 9, 1999, Los Angeles police detective Robert Dinlocker showed both Wilbone and Speedy a photograph of the four-door Chrysler in which they were seen on the night of the murders and asked them if that car was used in the homicide. 2 days later, Wilbone and Speedy were falsely told that they were going to be booked on murder charges. While being transported together to and from the courthouse, their conversations were recorded. Wilbone said, "I'm not really even sweating it, dawg, because all that shit that they got, that shit's wrong. But if them mofos would have shown me the car that we effing actually did that shit in, dawg, I'd be stressing like a mofo." The case goes on to describe a litany of racial incidents that both Wilbone and Speedy were allegedly involved in, and then it just outlines all the witness testimony of all the people who testified in the case. As you guys can see, I'm trying to change some of the verbiage in these statements because YouTube is starting to flag any content that has profanity in it. So that's why I'm changing it up. Wilbone seemed like a sharp dude from the interaction I had with him, but boasting about the details of his case to people you don't know is obviously not a smart move and has ultimately what sunk him. Wilbone got the death penalty and I believe Speedy got life. But this is just another example of the racial disparities that were taking place during this time out there in Southern California. Wilbone is a Samoan Sureño that I ran into in the adjustment center in San Quentin. There's another Samoan Sureño by the name of Freddie Smokey Fuyava from Barrio Linwood Young Crowd that's also there on death row. I believe he got convicted sometime around 2007, so I don't believe I was there when he landed on death row. He got convicted for the 1995 murder of Los Angeles deputy Stephen Blair in Linwood, California. Smokey, however, is a member of the Mexican Mafia. I'm not sure if he was recruited right there in the adjustment center or if they pulled him in the county jail, but as far as I know, he was an Imero. Meanwhile, another up-and-coming member of Azusa 13, Ralph Swifty Flores, was putting in a lot of work on the streets and was on the fast track of becoming one of the MS's biggest hitters. Swifty had a strong propensity for violence and seemed to be languishing in it when it came to spilling the blood of his victims. Surprisingly, at such a young age, he became an MA enforcer and tax collector in his neighborhood. He didn't get wrapped up in Operation Bright Lights Big City because that investigation didn't come until 3 years after Swifty's reign was already over. When the feds went after Azusa 13 for violating the civil rights of African Americans in Azusa, Swifty was already housed in San Quentin on California's death row. However, even though Swifty wasn't part of the federal RICO investigation that indicted 51 members and associates of his neighborhood, Azusa 13, he seemed to have shared some of the same kind of hate and disdain towards African Americans that was still resonating almost 3 years later. Some say that for more than 15 years, the Mexican Mafia prison gang has ordered some of Southern California's street gangs like the Azusa 13 to tax drug dealers and funnel the proceeds back to gang members. In some of these same areas, Mexican Mafia members have ordered street gangs to attack blacks. Two Mexican Mafia associates, Gabriel Downer Aguilar and Robert Thumper Ramirez, were paroled to Azusa in early 2000 and allegedly began organizing the gang to collect from local drug dealers. Azusa police gang investigators say both men were acting on authority of Jaques Jaco Padilla, the Mexican Mafia member reputed to control Azusa gangs and drug dealing from his maximum security cell. For a time, Aguilar lived on a tier with Padilla at Pelican Bay State Prison, enhancing his reputation on the streets of Azusa. On the other hand, Swifty committed his first murder when he was 17 years old. He shot and killed his first victim in 1999, 16-year-old Christopher Lynch, solely because of the fact that he was black. He then killed Claudia Cheney in 2003, shooting her several times as she ran inside her parents' apartment in Azusa. Swifty intended to kill Cheney because he and other gang members mistakenly believed that she had provided information to police that led to the arrest of her boyfriend, a fellow gang member named Anthony Martinez. Claudia Cheney had recently been arrested on suspicion of selling methamphetamine and was released after reaching a plea agreement with prosecutors. She was only in jail for a short time before she was eventually released back out to the streets. Unfortunately for her, her boyfriend, Martinez, had information that there was a confidential informant who was being used in his case. The identity of the informant remained under court seal, so it technically could have been anybody. All he knew is that someone had provided incriminating information about some of his crimes, and then there was a brief narrative of what that information consisted of. In situations like this, everyone close to you becomes suspect, and if anything suspicious arises, it piques your interest, despite the fact that you're just going off of speculation. I've seen this happen in a lot of cases, especially in indictment cases where there's multiple defendants. Someone either gets out of jail after getting caught dead bang with dope or something, or someone gets their case kicked out behind a legal technicality. Next thing that happens is people start speculating and assuming that this individual either cooperated or is working with law enforcement. The cold part about it is that people end up getting whacked in situations like this because the consequences of waiting and finding out for sure is too steep. They'd rather take someone out and whack them opposed to taking a chance and waiting until the paperwork is disseminated. This is what happened to Claudia Cheney. They thought she was the one who had provided information so that she would get consideration for her own legal problems. To make matters worse for her, there was also money involved, and this intensified the whole situation. Soon after Claudia Cheney was released, Azusa police arrested Martinez in a separate drug investigation. While in custody, he overdosed on heroin and died after one of the heroin balloons he ingested to conceal his clavo burst open. The problem with that is that the drugs belonged to the Azusa 13 gang, and now her boyfriend was no longer in a position to dissuade the suspicions that his homeboys were feeling. The gang eventually pushed the issue and blamed his death and the loss of their dope on Claudia. Later on, they would actually find out that she never cooperated or gave any statements to police, but by then it was too late and it didn't matter. Swifty killed his other two victims, Miguel Reyes, a member of a rival West Covina gang, and Fenice Luna, a former Azusa 13 gang associate, in December of 2004. Swifty shot and killed Reyes after he identified himself as a member of West Covina 13 at a Christmas party in Azusa. 3 days later, Luna was beaten and strangled after refusing to transfer ownership of her car, which the gang wanted to sell to raise for money for a defense attorney for one of its members. With regard to the murders of Luna, Swifty had two other co-defendants who were also fellow Azusa gang members, Steven Zamora and Frankie Martinez. Martinez was a baller in the neighborhood and came from a multi-generational gang family. He lived at his aunt's house located in Azusa on Nearfield Street. Flores and Zamora were considered to be senior members of the gang that had more seniority and time in the gang than Martinez. Zamora lived in the garage of a house located on Dwell Street that was used by numerous gang members as a place to socialize and ingest drugs. It was basically a trap house. Martinez's cousin, Anthony Almarez, was considered to be an associate of the gang. Roberto Romero was likewise an associate of the gang. and was friends with both Martinez and Alvarez. The victim, Fenice Luna, was a heavy user of methamphetamine and by all standards was considered to be a dope fiend. Approximately 1 year after the murder, Alvarez had introduced Martinez to Luna, and Martinez became her new drug supplier. Martinez and Luna spent a considerable amount of time together. In fact, some of the Azusa gang members actually thought that they might have been involved in an intimate relationship. In approximately 2004, Luna received a check for $35,000 for a workers' compensation award. Soon after receiving the check, she deposited the money in the bank. On the afternoon of December 28, 2004, Luna dropped $40 off with Martinez for a methamphetamine purchase, with the understanding Martinez would provide the drugs to her later. Martinez attended a nearby family party from approximately 4 p.m. until midnight. He obtained a small amount of methamphetamine for Luna at the party. However, he was low on the drug and needed to replenish his supply. Near midnight, Martinez returned to his residence on Nearfield Avenue. Alvarez and Romero stopped by to see him to pick up a little bit of methamphetamine. At some point, they were joined by Swifty. The foursome drove in Romero's Honda to a location where Martinez unsuccessfully attempted to obtain methamphetamine. Luna telephoned Martinez inquiring about the methamphetamine that was owed to her. Swifty asked Martinez who was calling. Upon learning that it was Luna, Swifty stated that he needed to talk to her. Martinez told Luna he had her methamphetamine and also asked her for a ride. This was to lure her over to where Swifty could talk to her. Luna, who had been smoking methamphetamine with friends in Glendora, agreed to come to Dwell Street to pick up Martinez. She explained to her niece that she did not want Martinez to have to walk in the rain. As Luna was en route, Romero drove Swifty, Alvarez, and Martinez to Zamora's residence on Dwell Street. Romero dropped Martinez and Swifty off, and at the direction of Swifty, she and Alvarez drove around the corner and waited for these guys to return. Shortly thereafter, Luna arrived at Dwell Street, driving her white Ford Expedition. Zamora, Swifty, and Martinez all entered Luna's vehicle. The group traveled to a nearby house where Martinez again unsuccessfully attempted to obtain more methamphetamine. Luna then drove them back to the Dwell Street house. Swifty invited Luna inside to smoke methamphetamine with them. Inside the garage, Swifty, Zamora, Martinez, and Luna settled on the couches and a recliner. After Luna smoked some methamphetamine, she passed the pipe to Zamora. Instead of taking the pipe, however, Zamora produced a taser and tased Luna in the neck. This was all planned. The taser apparently malfunctioned and had no effect on Luna. She stood up, freaked out, and asked what was going on. Zamora punched Luna in the face, causing her to fall, hitting her head hard on the ground. Her nose began bleeding. Swifty then punched Luna in the face numerous times. Luna screamed for Martinez to help her and begged the men to stop. Martinez claimed he was surprised by the attack and felt that Luna was a good person, but he believed that he could not come to her aid because Swifty and Zamora had more seniority as gang members than he was. Swifty told Martinez to fetch some rope and tie Luna up. Martinez found some blue rope in a box and Swifty placed it around Luna's neck. Swifty told Martinez to sit on Luna because she was fighting too hard. Luna, who was lying on her stomach and crying hysterically, continued to plead for help and repeatedly asked why. Swifty choked Luna hard, alternating tightly and loosening the rope. Zamora left the garage without saying anything while Luna was being strangled by Swifty. After a few minutes, Martinez got off Luna, who was still alive but had stopped resisting. Martinez left the garage and joined Zamora outside. Martinez telephoned Alvarez and Romero and told them to come pick him up. He and Zamora re-entered the garage. Martinez observed that Luna was dead. He wondered why they had to kill her, quote unquote, and, it is messed up. Without saying anything, Zamora began hog-tying Luna's body with the rope and strips of bed sheet. Swifty joined him and told Martinez to assist him in tying up her body in the sheet. Swifty told Martinez to turn Luna's expedition around in the driveway. Alvarez and Romero arrived at the house, and Alvarez assisted Swifty and Zamora in moving Luna's body into the expedition. At Swifty's direction, Martinez used a large board to block their actions from the neighbors' view. At Swifty's orders, Martinez drove the expedition to a random location in a residential neighborhood several minutes away. Swifty accompanied him, while Zamora stayed behind to clean up the blood in the garage. Romero and Alvarez followed in the Honda. They then abandoned the expedition, and Romero gave them a ride back to their respective residences. Swifty warned the others, "Don't say anything." On December 29, 2004, police officers discovered Luna's expedition with her body inside. Her arms, legs, and head had been hogtied with blue rope and strips of bedsheet. All but one of her long acrylic nails were broken off. An autopsy disclosed that Luna died from asphyxiation due to ligature strangulation. She had bruising on her knees, legs, back, and buttocks, indicating blunt force trauma. The bruises on her knees could have been caused by falling. The other injuries indicated she was beaten. She had serious swelling, bruising over her left eye, abrasions on her nose, and wounds to her hands that might have been defensive wounds. There were ligature marks on her neck and ankle. The cause of death was asphyxiation caused by ligature strangulation. Her injuries were consistent with strangulation, but not with hanging. Martinez, Zamora, and Swifty beat, tortured, and ultimately killed Luna in an effort to get her to provide money and to send a message to the community that refusing to comply with the gang would result in serious consequences. Martinez, Romero, and Paez would all later end up cooperating and testifying for the prosecution. As a result, Romero was later killed by two other Azusa gang members, Rodney Perez of Covina and Ramiro Juan Alvarez of Azusa. Prosecutors alleged that Alvarez and Perez targeted Romero because she had testified in the 2008 trial of Azusa 13 gang member Ralph Swifty Flores, who was sentenced to death after being convicted of 4 murders. Romero testified in the case Fenice Luna of Azusa, who Flores tortured and murdered in 2004 after she refused to sign over the title of her car. According to testimony heard during the proceedings against Alvarez and Perez, these guys forced Romero into a car in West Covina by threatening to harm her son if she didn't comply. So she basically gave up. Alvarez and Perez then drove her to a dark intersection at the corner of Glen Park Street and Bellevue Avenue in Pomona and forced her from the car. She was kneeling and begging for her life when Perez shot her in the head. Swifty was arrested by Los Angeles County Sheriff's detectives the next day. At the time of these killings, Swifty was 17 years old and was technically still a minor, so the prosecutor was conflicted on how to charge the case. However, after letting Swifty sit in the men's Los Angeles County Jail for a little over a year, the prosecutor finally announced that it was charging Swifty as a capital punishment case. Soon after Swifty turned 18, the prosecution moved forward with the case and charged Swifty as an adult. They probably had intentions to do it from the onset, but at the time of Swifty's arrest, he was too young to be charged as a Capital One case. It's been a little over 15 years since Operation Knockout and Operation Bright Lights Big City were launched by law enforcement in Southern California. Since then, a lot has obviously happened and things have died down drastically insofar as the racial disparities between some of the Sureño street gangs and the African Americans. Anytime bloodshed comes to a cease and there's a preservation of life, it's always a good thing. A lot of lives were affected by these conflicts, and for many, these memories remain painful reminders of the loved ones they lost. Whether it was the demise of a loved one, seeing a family member lose their freedom and get sent to prison for the duration of their lives, or whether a father, son, or brother was convicted and sentenced to death, the pain is the same. I'm sure all these things just didn't happen for reasons that hold no meaning and that there's some kind of underlying purpose. There has to be a learning experience in all this somewhere. I just haven't been able to figure it out yet. Racism, hate, contempt, and aversion are all ugly things people feel, inflict, and impose on each other. But I guess there needs to be the diabolical things in life in order for us to identify and embrace the good things in life as well. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. As you guys know, we're just getting ourselves back on track after being set back a few weeks. So just give us some time to catch back up on the content. We're already working on getting the next profile out now. As always, we appreciate you guys. We appreciate the support, your loyalty as our viewers, and just the fact that you guys have continued to ride this out with us. Above all, we just appreciate you as our viewers, as we know that without you, we would cease to exist.